on the other thing. And I'm live. Holy macaroni. I am live. Look at that. Holy crud. I'm going to pause the stream so everybody can see this. Okay. So what we're going to do. It's going to be fun trying to find where to start and where to end this. In the stream. Of course, the refrigerator goes off when I'm beginning this. Welcome to something kind of new. It's something I want to add on to what's going. Look, fridge, don't make that noise. Bad fridge. Don't make me turn you off because I never remember to turn you back on. I'm just gonna have to deal with it. Welcome to a very special stream because I managed to Frankenstein some stuff together, and it's working. I'm going to read Minecraft Dungeons Rise of the Arch-Illager by Matt Forbeck. And I'm going to do like the prelude in chapter 1 here today. And afterward, I'm going to talk about stuff. Talk about it. And then we might do a little more because chapters are pretty short. We'll see. Yeah, this is I'm like I have wanted to read this book, so I was like going, you know what? Why don't I just do an audio interpretation of it and then go over what I think as we go through the book, and that will be kind of cool because I've always been an avid reader and a writer, so it's kind of I've wanted to read this book and I've been trying to figure out how am I gonna turn pages and whatnot. I think I've got it. So. Without further ado, I present to you Minecraft Dungeons, The Rise of the Arch-Illager by Matt Forbeck. Now, this came out last year with Minecraft Dungeons. So, I waited a while for this. I didn't know the book was out, to be honest. I was like, there's a novel? Oh, God, I need to get this. I need to read it. So, yeah, I'm going to be reading to you this wonderful book. Rise of the Arch-Illager by Matt Forbeck. As read by myself, Geekonomicon. Pardon me. Carl wasn't sure why a bunch of undead mobs had decided to attack the raiding party of illagers who'd been roaming through the lands outside of the village he'd adopted, but he didn't question his good fortune. He'd been spoiling for a fight all week. Now, this otherwise dreary and rainy day, he finally had one on his hands. A smarter hero might have found a comfortable place to sit. Any clear stretch of grass, or even a convenient tree stump would do, and might have watched the entire battle unfold in the clearing below the hill on which he stood. It would have been easy to just let the two sides fight it out, wasting all their energy on each other. In the end, there might only have been a few foes left over to take care of, or maybe just to run off. But Carl was a man of action, a hero in his own mind, if not in the minds of others. So help him, the fight looked like fun, and he wasn't about to let all those fools down there have all of it. Oh my gosh, this guy. Bellowing a loud, wordless battle cry, Carl drew his jagged iron sword and charged down into the fray. A wide and reckless grin creased his face. The undead mobs were too focused on their current foes to notice the screaming hero racing toward them, but the illagers spotted him and began to break off from the fight. Carl cackled with delight at their reaction. Clearly, his reputation as a mighty warrior had preceded him. He could understand why the illagers would flee before him. They had lives they valued. The undead, who weren't burdened with such treasures, continued to ignore him, though. They chased after the illagers instead. Carl knew it wasn't terribly fair to attack foes from behind, but he'd never worried about such things. After all, the undead were mobs, right? And there were so many of them, it only seemed wise. He waded into the skeletons and the zombies, swinging at them from behind. Thwack, thwack, thwack. He mowed them down like fresh grass, his blades singing in a metallic song of death. "Death to the undead!" he shouted as he struck again and again. If he stopped to think about it, which he wouldn't, those words wouldn't make any sense, but he didn't care. The undead weren't about to correct him. Carl smacked a nearby skeleton, knocking it into a pile of bones with a single swing of his sword. He stopped to shade his eyes from the rain and watch as its bleached skull arced high over fleeing villagers and landed in front of them. They skidded to a halt before it, horrified at what its sudden appearance might mean for them. Carl threw back his head to laugh at their reaction, but when he was through, he saw that the remaining skeletons and zombies had finally figured out that he was the bigger threat and turned on him. The skeletons spread out to flank him, already peppering him with arrows from their bows. Meanwhile, a pack of zombies lunged toward him, filling the air with their wordless groans. Carl's smile grew even wider. "Bring it on!" he shouted as he plunged into the crowd of zombies and slung his blade back and forth, smashing down foes with every strike. There were downsides to being a hero. It was a lonely job in a strange land where you couldn't make a bit of sense out of the local language. You wound up saving the place over and over. No one ever bothered to say thank you. The only people who really got him were the other heroes, and they didn't always want to have much to do with him either. We'll save my commentary for later. But Carl didn't care about any of that. This was what he lived for. He never felt more alive than when he was beating down mobs and taking their loot. The zombies crowded so thick around Carl that they couldn't all get to him. Despite this, the skeletons kept shooting at him, planting arrows in the backs of their zombie pals. Carl spun about like a top, hacking away with his sword in every direction. Zombies fell away from him, toppling like saplings before an axe. Few of them managed to lay a rotting finger on him, and even those glanced off his armor, leaving him unharmed. As the crowd of groaning zombies around him thinned, an arrow finally made its way through the melee and caught him on the shoulder. It stuck in his armor, as if it had been fired into a tree. The tip of it had punctured the iron and stabbed into his skin, although not much further. The magnitude of the injury didn't matter to Carl. The fact that he'd been damaged at all made him see red. "Hey!" he shouted at the skeletons. "That hurt!" Furious, Carl put down the last of the zombies with a few quick blows, and then turned his attention to the skeletons. "You'll pay for that," he told them, "with your bones." He flanked the skinny monsters, moving to line them up in a rough row so that they couldn't all shoot at him at once. Then he began chopping his way through them like a farmer taking down grains at the harvest. First the zombies, now the skeletons. Jeez. The creatures peppered him with arrows, sticking several more into his armor, but all they did was make him angrier. Fighting skeletons was supposed to be fun for him, not dangerous. As the last bony beast fell before his mighty blade, Carl let out loose a howl of triumph and spun about to see who else might want a piece of him. His eyes fell upon the hapless Illagers, who had turned to face him, their weapons out and ready. Apparently, they'd found a courage in the defeat of the undead. They were too witless to shiver at his approach. Foes with any brains in their heads would have fallen to their knees and begged for mercy, but these nomadic raiders actually charged at him as if they stood a chance. The ridiculousness of the moment brought a laugh to Carl's lips once again. The anger he'd felt at the skeletons faded away, and he roared with delight as he threw himself and his sword against the oncoming Illagers. Before he could reach them, though, one of the Illagers, particularly short one with a massive nose, raced forward, spun about, and shouted something at his compatriots. He seemed to be pleading with them to show some sense, something that Carl had long decided wasn't worth bothering with when it came to such people. "They won't listen," Carl said as a little Illager, even though he knew no one would understand him. "They never do." Out of morbid curiosity, he fell upon he held up and let the tiny guy speak. If the imp wanted to keep his buddies from trying to take off Carl's head, well, he wasn't going to stop them. But he wasn't going to lower his sword either. The little guy gibbered along in his barbaric language, begging the others to see reason, to be swayed by the power of his logic, emotion, and words. Carl marveled at it the way he would have if he'd spotted a two-headed pig roaming around the village. Amazing, but beside the point. It didn't matter how crazy it looked. It wasn't going to make a difference. In the end, he was still going to whack it with his sword, probably. The other illagers listened to the little guy for a moment, but they steamed at him, clearly unhappy with whatever he was blathering about. The little guy's voice rose almost to a squeak as he reduced himself to what Carl could only interpret as actual begging. In the end, when the illager standing right in front of the little guy reached out and smacked him on the side of the head with the flat of his sword. Whoa. That put a sudden end to the squeaking, and the little guy toppled right over, senseless, before he hit the ground. Before the bigger illager could even call for an attack, Carl took him out with a sharp snap of his blade. He recognized a fight starting when he saw one, and he wasn't going to get caught flat-footed. "It's on!" he shouted at the illagers as he barreled into them, knocking them over like bowling pins. "It's on!" Over the course of the next few minutes, Carl systematically took down each and every one of the illagers. Some of them fought well, most of them didn't. Some of them tried to flee. He didn't let them. In his experience, if he allowed them to get away, they'd only come back to bother him later, or torch the village, or annoy him in some other way. The only way to make sure that didn't happen was to get rid of them for good. He might have felt bad about it, but they were the ones who'd attacked him, even after he'd saved them from all those undead mobs. "Not an ounce of gratitude from any of you," he said as he surveyed the tattered battlefield and the utter absence of anyone to stand against him. "So that's what you get." A high-pitched groan sounded from across the field, and Carl perked up his ears and squinted around to see if he could detect where it had come from. It stumped him at first, but after a moment he spotted an illager stirring on the far side of the field. He said as he strolled over to check on the one survivor. "Thought I got them all." When he reached the softly groaning illager, he realized his mistake. This one was much smaller than the rest. "Ah," Carl said as he recognized the illager who tried to talk some sense into the others. "The little guy with the big mouth." He knelt down next to the creature and turned him over onto his back. "Nice try there, fella," he said with a chuckle. "I mean, it was worthless, but I respect the effort." The sawed-off illager gazed up at him with dismay, and then tried to retreat. Since he was already on the ground, all he could do was worm away on his butt, right up until he bumped into the tree stump behind him. Carl got up, put away his sword, and dusted off his hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he told the little guy. "You did me a solid by distracting that big fella anyway. Once I took him out, the rest of your little band of misfit went down easy." The body the little guy had run into let out a moan. Carl edged up to the fallen illager and leaned over to get a better look at him. Was that the one he'd stabbed to start the battle with him? Honestly, he had a hard time telling the bandits apart. "That's all right," he told the little guy, who goggled at him with fear-struck eyes. "He doesn't look like much of a threat to anyone at the moment." Carl backed off a few steps and smirked down at the little guy. "Neither do you." He was feeling magnanimous at the moment. All he'd wanted to do was keep the mobs away from the village, and he'd managed that. Mopping up the last injured illagers just didn't seem worth the bother. An idea struck Carl then, something that would make him seem cleverer rather than lazy, at least in his own estimation. "Tell you what," he said to the little guy as the other illager seemed too miserable to manage to listen. "This is your lucky day. I'm going to let you and your groaning pal there go. You know why? The little guy couldn't possibly have understood Carl's words, but maybe he got the gist of them from his tone. Either way, he shook his big-nosed head in terror at just the right time. Carl flashed a white smile. Because you're going to go back to whatever you rotten, scummy Illagers call home, and you're going to tell the rest of your kind not to come here anymore. This village is under my protection, you get it? And when your people ask you what happened to you and all of your friends, I want you to tell them one thing. Carl held up his index finger to emphasize this particular point. One thing, right? The little guy gaped at him while he tried to parse what to do. Maybe he gave up, or maybe finally got it. In any case, he nodded so hard in agreement it looked like his head might fall off. Tell them my name, Carl pointed at himself. Tell them, Carl. Okay. Yeah, it sounded like an illager there or a villager there for a moment. Huh. Well, I didn't expect that. That's from the perspective of a village protector. So I guess that's how this whole thing starts. I've read the blurb on how. Keep this in mind. This is the Arch-Illager that we're reading about, the little guy. It's not going to be about Carl. Although I think Carl probably will come back into this because if you've watched the trailers, I think I know who Carl might just be. I think he's in there, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Yeah, so far, this isn't bad. It is designed for young adults, so not too unhappy with it. I do like the pacing on it so far. It's pretty good. Very unexpected. The fight, writing for the fights, I understand. You gotta give it a little bit of a flair for the kids, but the fight so far, fighting in it was like, could have been done a little bit better, but I'm not going to critique that too much, too heavily, too heartedly. Took me a lot longer to read that than I thought it would. Wow. Okay. No. So this is a 20, how many pages? I mean, how many chapters is this? 27? 27 plus an epilogue. Okay, cool. That was the prelude. And if you're watching this over on YouTube, make sure to follow me on Twitch because I'm reading it on Twitch because I have no way to edit anything on my computer at the moment because I've really lost everything and I can't afford to get an editing program right now. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. But for now, yeah. Let's continue so I can talk about this at the end here. Oh boy, here we go. Archie couldn't stand it anymore. The so-called hero who had taken down the rest of his raiding party strolled off, leaving him there among the ruin of the failed battle. And he hadn't been able to do a thing to stop it. All Archie could manage, was to seethe in frustration and fury. So the Arch-Illager's name is Archie. Interesting. Sure, technically, he could have picked up a sword and chased after the man, but what good would that have done? The only way that venture could end would be with Archie utterly defeated, and he'd had a rotten enough day already. He didn't want to cap it off with that. Instead, Archie pushed himself to his feet and surveyed the complete disaster that surrounded him. As the runt of his band of villagers, he was used to having bad days, but this topped them all. It was awful enough that Archie had been roped into joining the patrol designated to defend the rest of the Illagers from that marauding mob of undead that had been wandering too close to their lands, but to wind up as the only survivor, he didn't think he could return to the rest of the Illagers if he had to bring home news like that. None of them would already hated him that they'd probably kick him out of the tribe, and if that happened, he didn't have anywhere else to go. Archie had fully expected to meet his end today at the clawing hands and teeth of a zombie or a skeleton arrow. The irony that he had failed to even that made him struggle to choose between laughing and crying. He decided to do both. As he stood there, racked with sobbing guffaws, someone smacked him on the back of the head. Archie spun about, figuring the hero had changed his mind and decided to come back and finish off the job. He almost welcomed that. At least it would have put the misery to a quick end. Instead, he found himself face to face with something even worse. Thord. Thord had been Archie's nemesis since childhood. The vicious Illager had picked on Archie relentlessly for as long as either one of them could remember. The simple sight of Archie skulking around the dark forest in which they lived often spurred Thord to torture Archie with terrible taunts and even magical spells. Of course, Thord usually spent whatever spare time he had plotting against someone. It didn't take much to encourage him to ruin someone's day. The elders in the village, Illager's woodland mansion, had tried to clamp down on his tendency toward violence over the years, which perhaps explained why Archie had somehow managed to survive this day. But they'd failed often enough that Archie flinched every time he encountered his old foe. Unfortunately, he hadn't scurried away fast enough that morning when the elders had called for volunteers to join the raiding party. Thord had pointed out Archie trying to slink off unseen and had insisted on dragging him along instead, just so I can keep an eye on you. The one bit of good news about everyone else in the raiding party being taken down was that Archie wouldn't have to worry about Thord picking on him anymore. It might have been a small consolation, but he had clung to it. But somehow Thord had survived too. Of course. Thord snarled at Archie and staggered over toward the smaller Illager, nearly tripping over the hem of his long dark robes that marked him as an evoker. Oh, great. A dangerous Illager spellcaster. Archie could see how the hero had thought he'd taken care of the Illager. He looked more than half dead. If he'd stayed on the ground, Archie would never have suspected he was still breathing. "Don't just stand there gawking at me," Thord said. His voice curdled with humiliation and disgust. "Help me out!" Archie wanted to mock Thord in the evoker's moment of weakness, but he worried that Thord might still have enough energy to attack him with the spell. He leaped forward to try and support the evoker, who was wobbling precariously on his feet. Weak as he was, Thord smacked Archie away with the back of his hand. The smaller Illager tumbled to the ground, clutching at his stinging cheek. "As if a weakling like you could hold me up," Thord said with a shaky, frustrated sneer. "Find me a staff, or at least a sword." "But the undead are destroyed, and that hero's gone too," Archie said, both uncertain and suspicious about Thord's intentions. Lucky for him, Thord said as he staggered forward. "And for you. Now get me that sword." Archie glanced around frantically and found the weapon Thord was pointing at. It was battered and notched, but it at least was still in one piece. He snatched it up and handed it to the evoker without bothering to clean it off. Thord didn't seem to care a bit about how battered it was. He just grabbed the weapon by the hilt, stabbed it in the ground, and used it as a crutch. Then finally, stabilized, he gazed out over the battlefield and frowned. Archie didn't say a word. He knew from experience that anything he did could send Thord into a fit of rage, and he didn't want to trigger that. Not now, for sure. After a long moment, Thord spoke, his voice rough and low. "So, it's just you and me, then, isn't it?" Archie nodded. Thord sucked in at his teeth and grimaced. "You're gonna pay for this." Archie's jaw dropped. "But didn't have anything to do with this. I barely fought at all. Exactly, Thord said. When your people needed you most, you curled up in a ball and ignored them while they screamed for help. They fought on valiantly while you sat there and let them be defeated. Archie couldn't believe what Thord was saying. How could anyone think of that of him? He hadn't wanted his people to lose. True, he hadn't done much to prevent that, but that was beyond his control. As Thord and the others had taught him over and over throughout his life, he was a weak creature who couldn't make a difference in anything, no matter how hard he might try. And now Thord was going to hold him responsible for that. Archie, cringing in fear, I'm worthless. I always have been. I didn't even want to be here in the first place. And that's my point. You would have happily allowed that hero to defeat us all, the entire tribe, if you had the choice. You don't care about any of us. You let that hero destroy us, and don't even think I'm going to let you get away with it. Archie collapsed on the ground, unable to bear the horrors of the accusation. If Thord managed to limp back to the tribe and tell them such awful things about him, they'd probably destroy him on the spot. The best he'd be able to hope for would be eternal banishment. Oh, please, no! Archie gawked at Thord in dismay. I knew this would go wrong. I just knew it. I told you. Thord scoffed at him. Like mere words ever helped with anything. It pained Archie to hear a sentiment like that. As weak as he was, and as little as he knew of magic, a sword was useless to him. All he had was words. I knew exactly what was going to happen as soon as that hero arrived, and I tried to warn you, Archie said, trying to explain. I wanted to save you. I wanted to save us all. Thord snorted as Archie as if the pathetic Illager had just fallen into an outhouse and crawled out of the filth on his own hands and knees. You go ahead and try to tell that to the others. See what they have to say. He started staggering back in the direction of the Illager's mansion, deep in the nearby dark forest. Wait, Archie said as he scampered off after Thord. Why torture me? I'm no threat to you. It's that horrible hero you should be angry at. Thord didn't bother glancing over his shoulder at Archie. He's not at fault here. Can you really blame a hero for being a hero? It wasn't me who destroyed the others, Archie scrambled to catch up. I'm no hero. Haven't you had enough of them pushing us around? Illagers never run from a fight. Never. We ran from a hero. We were regrouping. Archie ignored the lie. But we couldn't have beaten one of them with a single patrol like that. We didn't have a chance. That was my whole and entire point. Archie grabbed Thord by the elbow. Thord ground to a halt with a painful wince and glanced down at him. You coward! He spat on him, striking him square in the side of his face. Archie wiped his cheek clean. We should have gone for help. We could have rallied the entire tribe together to take care of him. Think what that would mean. Thord rubbed his chin while he considered this. Mobilizing the entire tribe to gang up on a single hero? Exactly. Hope leaped into Archie's chest. Think about it. Think about how many Illagers there are compared to the heroes. If we could just gather every Illager, we can find and pit them against the heroes. Nothing could stop us. Thord snorted in disgust. You really are the most worthless Illager I've ever known. Imagine 5 patrols working together, or 10, or 20. I'm in charge here. If we brought all those Illagers together, who would be in charge then? Archie knew that it was all about power for Thord, much as it was for most Illagers. If only he weren't so short-sighted. But We fight heroes all the time, and how often do we win? Thor shook his head at Archie like he was an especially stupid child who'd been struck in the head far too many times. We don't hunt heroes. We just hunt, and we take down whatever we can. That's our way, and it's always been. There's no reason to change it. Archie pointed back at the battlefield where they'd suffered such a terrible loss. Isn't that reason enough? Thor grunted. What would you have us do? Start farming? Build villagers? Become civilized and weak? He sneered down at the smaller Illager. I suppose you're already halfway there. We have to try something new, Archie said. What we've been doing clearly isn't working. New heroes arise here every day. It won't be long until they build a village of their own, maybe a city even. You're a fool. And when that happens, they'll be unstoppable. We won't just lose a raiding party to them. We'll lose our entire tribe. That's coward's talk. Instead of the hunters, we'll be the prey. They'll track us down and destroy every last Illager in the land. Even as injured as he was, Thor moved faster than Archie could see. One instant he was leaning on the sword as a crutch, and the next the flat of the blade smacked into the side of Archie's head. The impact knocked Archie sprawling backward, stars spinning in his eyes. It took him a terrifying moment to recover his senses, during which he fully expected Thor to finish him off. When he finally regained himself, though, Archie saw that Thor hadn't bothered to keep at him. He just started off toward the dark forest once more without uttering a single new word. If anything, that terrified Archie even more. Okie dokie. Let's see. 30 minutes. All right. My thinking's on this. Whoa. Yeah, you kind of start feeling for Archie there. Okay. I had a feeling going into this that they were going to cast him in a sympathetic light because of the ending of the Obsidian Pinnacle, where you're pretty much picking him up and dusting him off and dancing with him. It's kind of a tragic tale. He doesn't belong with his own people, and I have a feeling we're going to find out what happens when he tries to go to a village and actually mingle with villagers instead. It's probably all just going to be, nah, you're an Illager. No. It's an interesting way to put that message. I like it. I like it a lot. Because that means, oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. And then there's Carl. Oh my gosh. Carl is just gung-ho. Slay first, don't think about it. That's kind of not cool. It's not cool at all. Thor, on the other hand, I have a feeling he's going to get his comeuppance. He's an evoker. They're in a woodland mansion. I have a feeling Thor is going to get his comeuppance. Probably one of the first characters that does. I don't know if he gets the Orb of Dominance in this, or it comes at the very end, middle. I have no idea. I'm betting this showcases everything that leads up to that original opening cinematic, where the heroes are there and then they're routed by the Arch-Illager's forces. They're just like, I don't know what to do. And I have a feeling that Carl is the one that faces off against the Golem and then says, nope, no thanks. Not going to fight that thing. That's going to be interesting. Yeah, I didn't think this was going to take me 30 minutes. Wow, that was going to take longer. Yeah, that's going to be it for this, though. I'm really eager to do more of this because it's a lot of reading and a lot of taxing on my lungs. It does take a lot out of me. So, yeah, tomorrow we'll do another couple chapters of this, and I'll do more of Minecraft Dungeons from the beginning too, and that will be tomorrow. This though, that's the end, guys. I will see you tomorrow. Final Fantasy 14 will return next week. I am going to add game time to it. I just have to find time to do that. I'll see you guys in the near future. Thank you for watching, and or in this case, thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon.